Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Moon Tortured by McKenzie Hunter, narrated by Georgina Marie. Chapter 1. I looked around the unfamiliar room, acutely aware of the light footsteps below me. This wasn't the first time I'd awoken in a strange place, naked and blood-stained, but it was usually in the woods with Bambi's or possibly Thumper's mutilated and half-eaten carcass lying next to me. Waking up in a stranger's house, naked, surrounded by a distinctive male musk, was inconceivable. My life just wasn't that interesting. Each time I moved, my body ached as it pressed against the hardwood floor. I tugged the blanket closer, brushing my sweat-drenched hair away from my face, slowly came to my feet, and looked around the meticulously neat room. The king-sized bed across from me was covered by a henna-colored, paisley-patterned duvet that looked like it had never been used. Dark mahogany nightstands were placed on each side of it, meticulously aligned with the headboard. Even the bronze-gourd lamps on the nightstands were perfectly centered. The room looked like a hotel room, but I had a feeling I wasn't in one. Where am I? I took a quick look at my reflection in the cheval mirror across from me. My hair was disheveled. A long scratch ran along my right arm, and plum-colored marks in the late stages of healing covered my shoulders and arms. Handprint-shaped bruises wrapped around my calves. I wasn't sure which was worse, the way I looked or the way I felt. The scent of blood and spiced musk inundated and lingered in the large space. The walls were solid and reinforced. They would be damn hard to break through without tools. When the double-paned security windows opened with ease, I breathed a sigh of relief. I was on the second floor. No problem. I've jumped from higher. Taking a seat on the small accent chair in front of the writing table, I looked through the drawers before delivering the same treatment to the dresser, nightstands, and walk-in closet. With the exception of the hangers I found in the closet, everything was completely empty. I looked out the window. It was late afternoon and the sun would set in a couple of hours. I was surrounded by what looked like nearly 20 acres of dense woodland. I assumed I was still in Illinois, but for all I knew, I could be in any of the other flat states surrounding it. Every visible area was covered by large masses of trees. There wasn't a neighbor in sight. If I screamed, it would go unheard. How far would I need to go before I ran into someone? I was about to find out. I quickly braided my hair and tucked it into a bun. Then I tightened the blanket around me. Before I could do anything, I heard light footsteps approaching. I wondered if I should stay in the room or wait to see who was coming. I opened the door. It was so thick and heavy it was an effort to open it. That must have been to block out sound. I poked my head out and saw him. I could never forget that tense, harsh grimace and his predacious movements. Forced to the surface was the memory of him standing in my living room, covered in blood, 4 bodies lying at his feet. He had killed them so effortlessly and brutally that my only instinct now was to run. I considered securing myself in the room, but it locked from the other side. Instead, I darted out of the room and down the hall, running past an oddly placed console and sprinting toward the stairs, nearly hitting the wall as the hall came to a dead end. Taking a sharp right turn, I kept running, barely holding on to the blanket. Saving my life trumped Midwestern modesty. "Skylar!" His voice was like sandpaper. I continued to run, lunging for the stairs in a frantic rush, but I didn't make it before a firm grasp yanked at the blanket, pulling me back. Crashing to the floor, I skidded backward and slammed against the wall. When he reached for my leg, I kicked him. Spinning on my butt, I kicked him again. My legs thrashed out, trying to keep him at bay. It was the same way they showed me in my self-defense class. Nothing seemed to deter him. His cruel gaze and vicious movements made his declaration that he wasn't going to hurt me hard to believe. Werewolf strength gave me a physical advantage most of the time, but he had my 5'8" frame by at least 4 inches. His lean, sinewy muscles flexed and tightened, holding exceptional power. With one swift movement, he grabbed my legs, immobilizing me, and pulled me into his arms. I was bundled so tightly that the only thing I could move was my head. His movements were so efficient and precise, it was obvious he'd done this before. Many times before. I clawed at his hands. When his hold didn't give, I bit down into his shoulder, grabbing more t-shirt than skin. I stayed clamped to whatever I had, doing whatever it took to keep him from taking me back to that lockable room. Steel-like corded muscles flexed and distended, making it difficult to keep a firm hold. The unforgiving muscles fatigued my jaw and made my teeth ache. But I hung on. Pounding down the hall, he seemed unaffected by my teeth embedded in his arm. He tossed me back in the room. When I wouldn't stop screaming, he leaned over me. "Shut up!" I couldn't. Yelling at the top of my lungs, I hoped someone, anyone, would help. I needed to be heard, to stop him before he did to me what I had seen him do to those 4 other people. He used one hand to cover my mouth and nose. His other hand snapped around my wrists, cuffing them over my head. "Stop it. If I wanted to hurt you, I would have, and you've given me more than enough reasons to do so." His fingers scorched against my skin as sharp, angry eyes demanded silence. Silence that didn't come easily, but instead was whittled into a whimper as I tried to grab oxygen from any space his hands would allow. As soon as I stopped struggling, he removed his hand from my face. His eyes narrowed as he examined mine. Frowning, he asked, What are you?" What am I? He doesn't know. I stared at him for a long time, remaining silent, refusing to talk to the man I had watched kill so quickly and violently that it would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. He studied me inch by inch, crevice by crevice, imprinting my face, features, flaws, and markings to memory. "What are you?" he asked again, his curiosity belied by his aversion. "Ethan, get off of her," commanded a firm, feminine voice from behind him. He stiffened at the sound. The woman's face, soft and round with small patches of freckles decorating her nose and cheeks, looked just as kind and gentle as her voice. Her deep auburn hair was pulled back into a ponytail, wisps of bangs angling across her face. Pale brown eyes cast a gentle gleam as she spoke. "Ethan," she urged again, when he didn't move. He stepped back, taking a position near the door as she inched closer to me. He continued to watch me, his thin lips twisted into a sneer. The glaring way he peered at me with his gunmetal gray eyes, in an odd state between revulsion and fascination, made me feel the decision not to hurt me wasn't his own. Noticing my reaction to Ethan, the woman turned to him. "Give me a moment," she requested warmly. "Please," she added when he was slow to respond. He gave me another chilling look before he walked out of the room. I came to my feet, securing the blanket around me, keeping my distance from her. "Who are you?" Her lips spread into a warm smile that was disarming and comforting. It was easy to imagine her standing in a classroom, surrounded by small children who looked upon her dotingly. "My apologies. I'm Joan." She pulled up a chair from the corner of the room and placed it in front of me. "Please, have a seat." I remained standing. "Where am I?" "You're in a retreat home." Keeping my focus on her, I stepped behind the chair, creating a barrier between us. She was very calming, parrying my skepticism, distrust, and anger with ease. Whether intentional or not, she made me feel like surrendering, like an unwary and trusting child. I didn't like that. "What am I doing at a retreat?" I asked abrasively. "I hoped you could tell me." She lowered herself to the edge of the bed, keeping the chair between us. "Skylar, what can you tell me about last night?" The long, uncomfortable silence didn't seem to bother her as she waited for me to speak. I took a seat at the edge of the bed. "There was a break-in. 5 men came after us. It happened so fast, most of it's just a blur," I admitted, frustrated. I fidgeted with my braid. "We ran. 2 men were up there. One grabbed me, the other my mother." I stopped speaking, unable to go on. The images were just erratic blurs bouncing around in my head. I didn't know what came first, or what really happened. I just knew the intruders were fast, strong, and hard to evade. It was as though they had anticipated every movement I would make. Their movements were so sharp and quick, I felt as though I were shuffling about in slow motion. Then Ethan appeared with a massive animal, a large coyote, maybe a wolf, and a tall, dark-haired woman. Chaos ensued. Blood and bodies moved around me so fast that I labored to stay out of the way, to avoid the gore and dismembered body parts. Then everything stopped. Well, for me it did. The sounds of violence whirling around me, bones crunching, grunts of pain, muscle and tissue ripping, came to an abrupt stop. My mother lay near the stairs, motionless, covered in blood, face pallid, chest stilled. I ran to her and immediately started CPR. I continued for 15 minutes. Ribs broke under my hands from panicked compressions, and my rescue breaths were so hard, her chest distended unnaturally. It felt like I couldn't push hard enough or blow breath deep enough into her lungs. I couldn't make the life, which I refused to accept was gone, respond. Exhausted and tearful, I finally conceded and accepted the harsh truth. She was dead. I was surrounded by 3 strangers covered in blood, 4 decapitated bodies, and my dead mother. I didn't want to be there to dwell in the intense emotions and violence, escaping in the only way I knew. I changed. Usually I fought her presence, but now I welcomed her gratefully, because standing in front of my mother's lifeless body was definitely where I didn't want to be. That is how my wolf functioned. When emotions ran so high that I could barely contain them, she showed up. I was never sure if it was to protect me or to offer an escape or reprieve. Nevertheless, it liked to be present when mayhem occurred. At that moment, I didn't care. They weren't men, Joan finally stated quietly. I lifted my gaze to meet hers, waiting for her to continue. They were vampires, Skylar. Why are vampires after you? I had seen the onyx-colored eyes, the fangs, and the pale skin, and yet I couldn't believe what she was saying. I turned into a werewolf every full moon, yet vampires still seemed to be folklore to me. Taking in what she said and what I just relived, I did what all sensible people do when someone tells them something horrific, unbelievable, and life-changing. I ignored and avoided it. Do you know what happened to my mother? Is she still at the house? I asked. My voice was hoarse and my lips trembled. The memory I had repressed so diligently surfaced with a vengeance, winding me. Her lying on the floor motionless. Her pale blonde hair, which was usually pinned up, was fanned out around her face. She was frozen in a liminal state of shock and fear. Joan bit down on her lips. Troubled eyes gazed at me briefly before they lowered to the ground. The body is downstairs. The body is downstairs. That same tight feeling that restricted my chest earlier had returned. It was debilitating. Heartbreak. It felt the way I imagined a heart attack would. You couldn't breathe, talk, or even think straight through the wrenching pain. I pressed my eyes firmly together, forcing back tears. Would you like to see her? No, I don't want to see her. As long as I don't see the lifeless body, I don't have to accept it. I don't. I won't. I can't see the body. When she reached over to touch my hand, I jerked it back. Her eyes roved over the room, and periodically she looked in my direction. Some of your clothes are in there. She nodded at the bag she'd brought with her. You should shower and get dressed. Maybe then you will be ready to see her. Where am I? The address? I asked, peering out the window, briefly appreciating the crowning beauty of the autumn. Being around her was a hell of a lot better than Ethan, but I didn't trust her. The bathroom is over there, she said, pointing to my right. The address? I repeated impatiently. Her smile deepened, revealing a small dimple at the corner of her right cheek. You're anxious. Perhaps a warm shower and food will ease you, she continued, in that soothing voice that people often used with children during their tantrums. I will be more than happy to answer your questions afterward. Her insolence was vaguely buffered by the mildness of her voice. It was apparent that until I did what she said, I wasn't getting any answers. Why do you change locked in a cage rather than the woods? She inquired before I stepped into the bathroom. Of course they went through my house. Did I really think they wouldn't? She knew what I was, and I didn't have the energy to deny it. I looked over my shoulder. Because animals belong in cages. The look eclipsed her face so quickly. It was a flash, easily missed. She looked aggrieved, perhaps even offended. And the sedatives? It doesn't like being caged, and I haven't found a way to put it down without killing me. I glanced down at my wrist. The years had faded the scar into a thin, light line, but it was a constant reminder of how much I hated that part of me. At 15, the typical teenage angst, pimples, and a gangly body that didn't want to cooperate were further complicated by my horrid transformation into a wolf. The moon called. and I responded. My body pulled and contorted to torturous limits, ripping at my humanity, until the only thing left was the unfamiliar feral animal. A werewolf. I gave in to the depression and the iniquity, but it refused to be put down. The only thing I accomplished that night was hurting my mother and realizing I wasn't as strong as I thought. That night, she vowed to make my life as normal as possible. I changed into a wolf every full moon. How normal could my life be? I lifted my gaze to meet Joan's. It was just a beat as it dropped from mine. She saw the scar where I had slashed my wrist repeatedly with a silver blade. Too many assaults to the same area prevented it from healing well. It left me scarred with a constant reminder of what I had done. I waited, watching her reaction, anticipating the horror, the intrigue, even the concern. And there it was, concern. The same look my mother gave me when I spoke of the wolf as though it were a separate entity. My mother always wanted me to embrace it, but I couldn't. As far as I was concerned, it was an unwelcome guest that showed up once a month despite my objections. It was a plague, a betrayal of my humanity, and I refused to accept or embrace it. Instead, every full moon I would lie locked in a cage, sedated, until it was all over. At least I could pretend my life was my own, and I was somewhat normal. "I'll be here with some food when you're done," Jones stated with a plaintive smile. If taking a shower was supposed to calm me, she was mistaken. Instead, it heightened my anxiety. Fight or flight egged me on to respond. On the countertop were my blow-dryer, my curling irons, my toiletries, my sonic toothbrush, and my beauty products. I stared at the counter. These were my things placed neatly on a stranger's bathroom counter. I rummaged through the cabinets, the linen closet, and the medicine cabinet, not quite sure for what. My head was starting to ache as I tried to make sense of this. Have I been abducted? If so, they sure are some thoughtful criminals to care about my comfort. I tried to make light of the situation because if I didn't, I was going to spiral into a panic. The woman who stared back at me from the vanity mirror didn't make things better. I looked terrible. My thick, curly hair was barely contained in the braid. Olive skin that usually looked vibrant was now dull and blanched. Desolate eyes reflected back at me, darkened to the point that they looked jasper rather than emerald. I quickly pulled my gaze from the mirror. For a brief moment, I considered fleeing out the small window just above the garden tub. Instead, I sat on the edge of the tub, formulating a plan on how to make an escape. I could go through the bathroom window, but for some reason, I felt like I would be met with the angry psycho from my earlier attempt. If I could manage to get past Joan, could I get past the people I heard downstairs? I showered, taking an exceptionally long time. Part of me hoped Joan would have given up and left. I opened the overnight bag with my clothes in it and put on a t-shirt and a pair of yoga pants. I'd give it to them. They were oddly meticulous and thoughtful, which should have comforted me. But it didn't. Weren't psychopaths and serial killers usually meticulous? When I walked out of the bathroom, Joan was seated in a chair next to the bed. A waiter's cart sat next to it with an assortment of sandwiches that filled the room with alluring scents. My stomach began to rumble. "Please, have a seat." She patted a spot on the bed near her. Slowly I walked toward her, watching her intently as I sat farther away than the spot she pointed to, closer to the door. "Why am I here?" "Eat. You must be famished. You've had quite the night," she urged in that same gentle voice. It was still soft and warm, but it no longer soothed me. Instead, I now found it irritating because I figured she was doing it to manipulate me. It was hard to break the social rule and be a raging jerk to someone who was being exceptionally kind. She slid the cart of food toward me. There were several roast beef sandwiches, bags of chips, and sliced fruit. I usually liked my sandwiches warm, but I was too hungry to let something like that stop me. Discreetly, I sniffed the sandwiches. They seemed okay. I hesitated for a moment before I took a bite. I was on my second sandwich when she inched toward the edge of the chair. Studying me, she seemed distracted by her own thoughts. After long moments of intense silence, she asked, "Do you know why the vampires were after you?" "No, but I'm sure you do," I challenged, waiting for her to explain why Ethan and his crew of hostile strangers were at my home. "Joan, is it?" She nodded. "Why am I here?" Her smile broadened as her gaze wandered. I suspected she was getting her story together or establishing a believable lie. "The vampires have taken a special interest in you." "And?" It came off harsh and ruder than intended, but I hated having to extract information question by question. Her thin lips curved into a demure smile, trying to diffuse my growing exasperation. I continued, tone crisp, gaze jarring. Ethan rushed in like they expected them to be there, as though they were just waiting for them to strike. What do you know that I don't? Their attack was anticipated, but the reason is unclear. We've been petitioned to keep you safe. Her tone and inflection were cooler now, more professional. The tension that came off her made me uncomfortable. She was withholding, but I wasn't sure how much. Is my mother really downstairs? I want to see my mother, I admitted. If she were really here, then I could determine how much trust I was willing to put in Joan. If she took me downstairs, I could explore the retreat and plan my exit strategy. She nodded slowly, and I followed her out the door down the long hallway. As we descended the stairs, the footsteps and sounds of movement seemed to come to a hurried stop. They scattered at my approach. Now those noises were nothing but phantom sounds from people I could never identify. As I followed her to the left, we walked past the large great room decorated for function, not design. 2 solidly built sofas were at the opposite ends of the room, separated by muted geometric patterned accent chairs. A large dark leather ottoman was placed in the middle. If I were watching one of those design shows on HGTV, they would call the room something catchy like Modern Chic Meets Functionality, as a bubbly designer fixated on the mundane details of the decor. What I saw was furniture that was so durable it couldn't be broken. 2 deep claret-colored sofas that could easily hide most stains, most likely blood. I smelled it in this room. Blood had been spilled many times throughout it. With a normal sense of smell, when blood is washed away, so is the scent. But for me, it was only dulled to the point that it could be ignored. I stayed close to Joan as she took me around the corner and we passed another room, which I assumed to be the living room. In most households, the room's only purpose was to showcase elaborate decorative furniture, art, and collectibles. This room was slightly different. The sofas were a luxurious tan, more traditional, still durable. Instead of an ottoman in the center of the room, there was an ornate wool rug. Unique pictures of wildlife and nature covered the walls. The rust and cream paint were blended together in an intricate and charming faux finish. It was aesthetically pleasing, but it also hid the subtle markings and dents of a battered wall. I wondered who, or what, battered them. This might be the room they used to show a more refined side of themselves, but blood had been spilled here as well. I couldn't help but wonder why the people who resided in or visited this house had so many accidents, lost so much blood, bled so often. My curiosity was a weighted vest, making it hard to continue following Joan. I wanted to make a mad dash for the nearest door, and probably would have, but I had to see my mother. I trailed Joan down the lengthy hallway, through plain white double doors into another hall. It looked like an addition to the house. After a left turn, I found myself in a hospital, rather a home version of one. The walls were white and sterile, and the floors were the same high-gloss tile that you see in doctors' offices, hospitals, and clinics. It's not that I had a lot of experience in doctors' offices or hospitals. My mother was a pathologist. When I needed a doctor, she was there. I rarely needed her in that capacity. As a child, I wasn't plagued with the same childhood problems as others. Broken bones? Not a chance. If I fell from a tree, I would walk away unscathed. A skinned knee was healed before you could get the bandages out of the box. I never had a cold, flu, or even the chicken pox. Yet I had somehow built up the antibodies. My mother did the blood work. Things like that didn't just happen without her poking me with a needle and drawing blood to find out why. Those things should have clued her in that something was very wrong with her daughter. Perhaps she knew and did an excellent job of hiding her "my daughter's a freak" look. Joan and I continued down the hall past 3 doors that were numbered. I assumed they were recovery rooms, but for all I knew, they could have been little prison cells. Each one was locked from the outside, and 2 were padlocked. I decided then that as soon as I saw my mother, I was leaving. This beautifully decorated house was just camouflage for all the iniquities it hid. Finally, we made a right down another hallway. I paid close attention to every turn, every loop, despite the fact the house was a maze. When she opened another set of double doors, the room temperature dropped. Chill bumps rose along my arm. The open room smelled of disinfectant, sulfur, and medicine. There were 7 beds, separated only by dividing curtains. Perhaps there were 9. 2 of the curtains were closed. Near the desk at the far end of the room was an examining table. At the other end of the room was a microscope with testing supplies. Multiple cabinets filled with medical supplies were placed throughout the room. Why the hell do they have a hospital in their house, and why do they require so much medical attention? Joan pulled back the thin dividing curtains. My mother lay on the examining table. With pale skin and bluish lips, her face was peaceful, void of life, and the jovial expressions that it always held. This was my mother, or rather, her body. The lifeless shell of the woman who took me into her life, her home, and raised me as her own after my mother died giving birth to me. She was the person who forced me to learn Portuguese in order to have some part of my birth mother with me, who did everything she could to give me a normal life, despite the circumstances that would deny me that. I closed my eyes, reluctant to open them again and accept the reality that my mother was dead.
"Skylar,"
said a deep, sympathetic voice behind me. I turned slightly toward the tall, slender gentleman with silver hair, with hints of dark gray. A congenial smile settled on his ruggedly handsome face. I didn't respond. Everyone seemed to know who I was, but didn't bother introducing themselves. "Who are you?" I asked icily. I couldn't believe how incredibly rude I sounded. When your mother was lying dead in front of you, being impolite was acceptable, or, at the very least, understandable.
"I'm Dr. Jeremy Baker. You are welcome to call me Jeremy."
He looked down at my mother, his empathy and concern apparent. I felt like a jerk for being so rude to him.
"I wish there had been something I could have done for her, but she was gone before she got to me. We couldn't even consider changing her."
He ran his fingers through his thinning hair. Narrow, aristocratic features may have made him look cold, but I didn't think he was. After a few moments, he gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. He and Joan left the room, leaving me alone to grieve. And grieve I did. First, shock made it hard to cry. Instead, I stared at her, in a frozen state of disbelief. This isn't happening. No, this can't be happening. Whether or not I chose to accept it or live in a state of utter denial, it happened. There she was. Or rather, her body. All life was gone from her. The reassuring smile and gentle eyes that always made things seem less perilous and easier to handle were absent. The delicate lines of her face relaxed into an eternal sleep. Her skin was the palest I had ever seen, and her lips were cracked and a silvery blue. Now, she was nothing more than a lifeless body. She was dead soon after the attack. After I stopped the CPR, I tried to accept it. She was gone. Taking another look at her, I crumpled into the small space next to the bed. I cried until the urge to scream dwindled to a whimper. When I was done, my eyes were dry, tear ducts battered, and my throat parched from sobbing. When I walked out of the room, Joan stood by the door waiting for me. Her lips curled into a gentle, sympathetic smile. As she guided me back to the bedroom, I aimlessly followed her in a dissociated state, barely noticing the new rooms she took me through. This wasn't a house. It was an estate. Or worse, a compound. I didn't see them, but I could feel all eyes on me. They were skulking in the shadows, eerily watching me as I moved through the house. I wondered if they were hiding from me, or if they didn't want me to see them. I wouldn't be able to name names or identify the faces of the people I hadn't met if needed. Periodically, I would look over my shoulder, hoping to get a glance at a face or catch a glimpse of the people who were so obsessively watching me. As we walked up the stairs, the dark-haired woman who had accompanied Ethan into my home was descending them. Her gaze met mine briefly. She appeared hard and palpably unwelcoming, yet I couldn't drop my eyes from hers. There was something hauntingly intriguing about her. I stared at her as she passed us. Feeling my attention, she craned her neck to look back at me, and her deep, hazel human eyes changed to snake eyes? Long vertical slits sharpened, making her pupils resemble those of a serpent. I stared at them, transfixed, unable to pull my gaze from hers. "Winter, is everything okay?" Joan inquired, turning to focus on the woman with the peculiar eyes. She ripped her gaze from mine to look at Joan, her eyes back to Hazel but arctic cold.
"Of course," she responded in a low, terse voice.
She glided down the stairs with soft, purposeful movements, giving me the impression that I only heard her moving because she desired it. Any other time, she probably moved in silence, undetected, a predator on a perpetual hunt. In the room, I sat on the bed trying to focus and gain perspective on what was going on. What did Dr. Baker mean? That he couldn't change her?
"As were-animals, we have the ability to change others to our form. If the process is successful during the conversion, most, if not all, injuries are repaired."
Her eyes roved over my face, assessing me.
"A change to a lesser species isn't as traumatic, but the conversion doesn't allow the best physical repair. As you can guess, change to a greater species is far more aggressive, and the survival rate is low, especially if the person is physically compromised. We were left without options for your mother."
Were-animals? Is that what they are? Humans forced to share their body, their life with an animal? Like me? You are all werewolves? Then I remembered the animal that was at Ethan's side when he barged into my home. It wasn't a wolf. With everything going on around me, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me when I saw a person in the phase of mid-change. By the time I focused on him again, he was a coyote. Well, I assumed the massive thing was a coyote. Its features resembled one. But it was larger than anything I had seen in the woods or zoo. It viciously ripped into the man, or rather, vampire, killing one of the 4 people who entered my home. She nodded her head slowly. More than just werewolves, were-animals. Why am I here? I was hesitant to ask. The more questions I asked, the weirder things became. Werewolves, or rather were-animals, vampires, and beautifully decorated compounds with built-in hospitals. "Because you need help," she stated elusively. "What if I don't want your help?" The muscles around her neck tightened marginally, but she maintained the same pleasant smile. "I hope you will accept it and stay here. Then we can guarantee your safety." She was very cautious and deliberate in choosing her words, despite the assertive undertone and my efforts to resist. When she spoke, it was soothing. I was silent for a long time, looking around the room. Now there were more of my things in it, set up for an extended stay. "Why do I have a feeling that your request is just a courtesy and I really don't have a choice in leaving?" "We will not keep you here against your will. However, it will make it much easier to keep you safe here. The vampires are wise enough not to come here," she continued, maintaining a professional yet gentle tone. "If I choose, I can just take my things and leave? No questions asked?" My eyes narrowed, scrutinizing her. I was having a hard time believing that.
"We hope that you choose to stay," a baritone voice added. I swallowed a gasp. My body tensed. Some people have the ability to command a room, others to control it. When someone does both, it is consuming. He was a presence that occupied the large room, shrinking it to a quarter of its size. I felt the urge to find a small space that he didn't occupy and cower. His skin was a flawless deep espresso brown. His full lips, which should have overwhelmed his face, did nothing but enhance it, despite the fact they were dipped down into a frown. Prominently defined cheekbones and a strong jawline made the look of reproach he gave me even more severe. My gaze fixed on his oval light brown eyes that were so imposing they trapped me where I stood. As he moved farther into the room, the waves of muscles that clung to his broad build moved in unison with each step. "Skylar, this is Sebastian, the alpha of the Midwest pack," Joan explained with her brow raised as a warning. She nodded, or rather bowed her head to him in a respectful greeting to acknowledge him. I forced contact with the male whose mere presence left me wishing I could be anywhere else. "Nice to meet you, Sebastian," I lied. Crossing his arms over his chest, he nodded a greeting. His eyes roved over me inquisitively. The frown remained. Whatever he saw, it left him either disappointed or unimpressed. "I am extending an invitation for you to stay here for your own protection. You will not be safe in your home any longer," he stated firmly. "It would be advisable that you accept." "But if I choose to decline your help and leave, I'm free to do so, right?" I challenged. Joan implied that I could leave at any time, but my gut was telling me otherwise. His face tensed. I got the impression Sebastian wasn't questioned or denied often. "No one will stop you, but I doubt you will be gone long before the vampires come for you again, and your fate with them will be far worse than being a guest here," he responded in a crisp tone. I tried to meet his gaze, but it was too intense. Scary. "Who petitioned you to protect me?" The stern look remained as he spoke. "That's irrelevant. They want you alive. That is all you need to know." "And the vampires? Why do they want me?" Now that I knew there were other were-animals, enough to form a pack, this had nothing to do with me being a werewolf. Except for being a werewolf, there wasn't anything else exceptional about me. "At this time, we don't have that information," he admitted in a stiff voice. "Let me see if I understand. The vampires have an interest in me. You were petitioned to protect me by someone who seems to want anonymity, and you have no idea what the vampires want with me. But still, you have chosen to help me?" I asked incredulously. It was obvious from the way the muscles of Sebastian's neck and jaw twitched with tension that he didn't like questions or being in the dark any more than I did, and pointing it out wasn't winning any favor with him either. "Why would you choose not to stay?" I shrugged. "Let's just say I have trust issues and don't believe in altruism. I don't understand why you want to help me." That was a slight lie. I did believe in altruism, but I surely didn't believe he was capable of such an act. He nodded his head slowly, still assessing me with that penetratingly intense gaze. Sebastian didn't just share his body with his animal. He had bonded with it and become one with it. The primordial nature of his animal was so tightly interwoven with the man before me that he was something different. A manimal. There was a protracted silence. His brown eyes flickered to deep amber, and I was faced with very familiar animal eyes. Sebastian was a wolf, like me. Well, maybe not like me. The animal that stared back at me projected a level of danger that left me shaken. I doubt even on my best day I could ever be that terrifying in human form. "We saved your life, Ms. Brooks. I think we have earned your trust." Have they? The only thing I knew about these people was they knew how to kill, savagely, effectively, and efficiently. They lived in a well-equipped compound that smelled of spilled blood. They were half animals that gave into their primal urges gregariously. They hadn't earned my trust. The only thing they had earned was my innate wariness and self-protective urge to get as much distance between them and me as possible. Impatient, waiting for me to respond, he directed his attention to Joan. If she is too foolish to accept our help graciously, then she will have it begrudgingly. She can stay as our guest or our prisoner. I don't care about the spirit in which our invitation is taken. Then he stalked out of the room, leaving me staring at the empty space he once occupied. Joan's lips trembled slightly before she swallowed hard and mustered that oddly pleasant smile. Skylar, there isn't much more for you to understand. The vampires came to your house, killed your mother, and attempted to abduct you. Their intentions for you are unknown at this time. This is fact. It is in your best interest to stay here for the time being, until we have this situation under control. When I didn't respond, she continued taking small, deliberate steps, pacing in the small space that separated us. Forcing me to stay isn't really helping to build my trust. Her voice still had the gentle cadence, but now there was a hint of urgency and frustration that she was working to suppress. Demetrius wants you alive. Never before has he orchestrated something so extreme for one person. He sent his best for you. Reading the confusion on my face, she elaborated. Demetrius is the master of the Northern Seath, the strongest in the world. The vampires aren't usually a menace, choosing to spend most of their time whoring around and satisfying their lusts in varying degrees. But when Demetrius peeks his head out from his self-indulgences, he likes to flex his power. When he does, it's never good. He may want you alive for now, but I can assure you, it probably won't be for long. If her intentions were to scare me, then she had won a gold star. They will not stop until they have you, for whatever reason that may be. I can assure you that they will hurt and even kill anyone who gets in their way. You are under the Midwest Pact's protection. It is a responsibility not taken lightly. I assure you, the Pact does not enter situations foolishly or without adequate cause. Do yourself a great service and accept our help. You won't survive alone. I chewed on my bottom lip, hanging on to her words. I am sorry if I seem ungracious. It isn't my intention, I finally admitted, so softly I wasn't sure if my words were even audible. I don't know if you realize it, but a lot is being asked of me. You want me to trust you with minimal specifics. I'm forced, or rather strongly encouraged, to stay in a house with were-animals that are obviously dangerous. Until today, I didn't know were-animals existed. I let out a distressed sigh. That was a partially true statement. I never thought I was the only werewolf in the world, but I had no idea other types of were-animals existed. I'm not saying it's not a lot to deal with, but don't make it any harder on yourself. Our contact is out of the country right now. He is expected back in 5 days. At least remain our guest until then. Contrary to what you have seen, Sebastian is a fair and reasonable leader, and I am sure he will allow you to speak to our contact when he arrives. Okay? Who is your contact? I needed more information. They had to at least tell me who was so diligent about protecting me. After a furtive glance at the door, she spoke, but it was barely audible. Josh. I had a name, but I had no idea who it was. Josh? Who was he, and why did he want me alive? Most importantly, how did he know I was in danger? Joan was still waiting for an answer. Who is Josh, and why does he care whether I live or die? The pleasant smile returned, and I knew she wasn't going to give me any more answers. That is all the information I can give you. Will you at least stay with us the 5 days? Why was she asking me? Did I really have a choice in this matter? Sebastian made it clear. Guest or prisoner, I was staying. Joan waited for a response that I was unable to give. She gave me another congenial look before she left.